All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we're going to talk about types of marriage contracts. Someone might say, well, is there such a thing as types of marriage contracts? I mean, you basically decide to get married and it becomes one type of marriage contract. What do you mean types of marriage contracts? So that's what I'm going to be explaining today because there are some details that we need to talk about because we know, and from what we had studied, we said a marriage contract would be one, if I were to have ijab and qabul, so the offer and the consent, and I had the witnesses and I had the wali, all right, and we basically had the different conditions for a valid marriage. So we're talking about reaching the age of puberty, we're talking about a Muslim man and a Muslim woman, or a Muslim woman, a Muslim man, sorry, and perhaps maybe a Jewish non-combatant or a Christian non-combatant that is bashful, etc. So this you just said before that these are the basis of a valid marriage contract. So what do you mean types of marriage contracts? So those are the different things that people basically had different circumstances, and there were some different types of marriage contracts that scholars debated on their validity. Just keep that one in mind. Scholars debated on their validity and where did these types of marriage styles basically come from. So some of them might have been developed based on necessity. Some of it was always in these marriage contracts. Money has a lot to do with these ways. And of course, when you talk about money and how much money can actually bring a change, of course, business people are probably the most to invent different ways of being sneaky. Okay, so yeah, you're going to see money is involved in each and every single one of these because we are basically, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَأُحْضِرَتِ الْأَنفُسُ الشُّحَّ. Every single one of us basically has a piece that, of course, we might all deny, but this is a reality. This is a reality in all of us, which is basically greed. It's in all of us. It's in us, and therefore that brings in the types of marriage contracts. So let's talk about some of them. The first one is mut'a marriage. Now, just a little thing about history and what is a mut'a marriage. Well, first of all, mut'a marriage is basically marrying someone for an appointed limited time set in the contract. So what does that mean? They both agree that they would be married to each other for a month, or perhaps maybe he's a student in the US and probably just wants to get married just temporarily and just until he graduates his bachelor's studies, for example. So he says, I'll marry somebody just for 4 years. And they basically they made a marriage contract based on that. In other words, it wasn't a permanent marriage contract. Now, here's one thing is that in the beginning of Islam, the Prophet ﷺ did permit and or at least did not prohibit this type of marriage. Just as in the beginning of Islam, alcohol was not prohibited, just as so many different things in the beginning of Islam, they were not prohibited, and prohibition or, the whole change of legislation did not happen until later on. That's the same thing with mut'a marriage. At one point, the Sahaba were practicing it, and it was known, and it was out in public, and it was a culture that everybody was familiar with, and everybody was okay about. So, and of course, when we're speaking about temporary marriage, we're talking about a certain marriage that basically would mean that there's no inheritance and they would divorce based on the expiration date. Okay. Do they agree from the beginning at a date? Yes, they can agree at the beginning from a date. Now, all Sunni scholars regarded that temporary marriage is invalid. Malik, the scholars in Ahl al-Madinah, the Sufyan, Abu Hanifa, al-Shafi'i, and the Layth ibn Sa'd, al-Awza'i, al-Imam Ahmad, Ishaq, Abu Dawud, etc. So, but there were some names of even Sahaba, just like Abdullah ibn Abbas, who actually, when the Prophet ﷺ died, he was almost 11 years old. But the majority of the Sahaba, they said, well, no, mut'a marriage, the final thing. And that's what brings Ali ibn Abi Talib in. Ali ibn Abi Talib made it clear, and the narration is authentic. In fact, it's in Sahih al-Bukhari, that he said that the last thing that the Prophet ﷺ had said in regards to temporary marriage or mut'a marriage is that it was invalid until Judgment Day. And that when did that happen? That happened during the time of Khaybar. All right. So here's the thing, is that this brought in, I guess, that type of debate between the scholars that might have adopted Ibn Abbas's opinion and the scholars that said, well, Ali ibn Abi Talib said this and this. So you had not just Ali ibn Abi Talib, but a set of different scholars. Now, this did not only stay within, let's say, the Muslim or Ahl Sunnah alone, but this also became a common thing that is practiced mainly but from Shia. So it's a practice that Shia would practice and consider that as a completely legitimate type of marriage. And in fact, it's widely practiced, especially in Iran, widely practiced among the Shia. And in fact, it can go as low as a couple hours, and which basically is another reason why you would see prostitution becomes as something that is widely practiced in those areas, but they'll give it a name to make it that, yes, it's a mut'a marriage, it's a halal relationship. And certainly it is practiced even by those that would be at the top level of basically scholarship in the Shia community. So of course, when you have all of this, this becomes more of a practice of for Shia, but not for Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they finally came to an agreement pretty much. I mean, pretty much you could see that all the madhahib, you could see that they all basically pretty much landed on the final evidence, since it was proven that mut'a marriage is not permissible and that it is invalid. But then they debated like Abu Hanifa. Let me explain one thing. If we were to have an invalid condition in a marriage contract, does that invalidate the whole marriage, or does that condition alone become invalid? All right. And that's that area that Abu Hanifa disagreed with the rest. And he said, well, the condition itself becomes invalid, but the rest of the marriage is basically valid. And they would have to recognize that this is an invalid condition, but the marriage contract would be considered as valid. But not when it comes to the mut'a marriage. They considered that if there is a timing set or an expiration date set, that basically means that this whole marriage is invalid, because the whole premise that it was founded on is basically putting in a certain timing, and therefore the whole concept of mut'a marriage or temporary marriage is basically invalid. They both have to come in with the intention that this is going to be a permanent relationship, and that both would basically set all their power to make it permanent and not come in with an intention that this is temporary. So let's say right there, speaking of madhab Hanafi and what they regarded, because we already know, you might say, well, where are the other scholars? Well, we already said that Malik, Shafi'i, Ahmad, right there, all those madhab, they already had said their final statement, said that this is from the start. This is batil. This is an invalid marriage, period. For madhab al-Hanafi, they're the ones that kind of went into, let's say, certain details, and that's why I'm commenting on these details. Zufar, who's Zufar? Zufar, I want you just to imagine that you had Abu Hanifa, and the brightest students were one, Abu Yusuf, or his name is Yaqub ibn Ibrahim. The second brightest student is Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani. The third brightest student is Zufar al-Hudhali. And the fourth, and we go on and on. There were more, but these are the most. Let's at least give 4 names, at least for us to start with. Those are the most important students for Abu Hanifa. Now, sometimes these students, of course, they didn't just stay students, they became future scholars, right? Students, they don't just stay students, they become, with consistency, with grit, with, more research, and they may sometimes even surpass their own teachers. So Zufar, he disagreed from the Hanafi scholars. He disagreed and he said, well, it's not invalid, but fasid. And I thought it would be a good idea to explain before I get into marriage contracts and all of that, because we're going to say valid and invalid and all of that. Thought it would be important to jump a little bit with speaking about validity and what a valid contract looks like, because I want to make sure before we get into those details that we understand the difference between fasid, batil, and what a valid marriage contract looks like and what we mean by that. So in terms of a valid marriage contract, so if we were to have, remember those 5 or 4 things, we said number 1 is the offer and consent. So the offer would come from the wali, the consent would come from the groom. Zawajtuka binti, and he says, qabilt. There we go. It was just 1 second. A valid marriage contract right there is on its way. And we had two male witnesses right there. And we had basically the wali is already there. And we also had a wedding. So here we go. We've got everything under control. And of course, the 2 people that are getting married, Islam, we've got that in place. Reach the age of puberty, we got that in place, etc. That's a valid marriage contract. Okay. Now, what if we were to have certain things that, let's just say, are not applicable? So what does that mean? So they would all agree that if I have a valid marriage contract that basically has all the pillars that we talked about: consent, offer and consent, the witnesses, the wali, their age, the issues about Islam and all of that, then we've got a valid marriage contract. Those are the pillars. The conditions are extra things. So what are we talking about conditions? Let's say one of those witnesses was blind, or one of the witnesses was deaf. He couldn't hear the offer and consent, and they didn't do sign language to make sure that this is understood to this deaf person. Is that a valid marriage contract? Wali, let's say the brother came in as the wali, and the qadi didn't know that dad was alive and that he was even right there within the neighborhood. So the brother comes in, and then the wali, which is the father, comes in and says, wait a minute, when was I skipped? How did you skip me? What happened? And then, is this a valid marriage contract or not? Now we're looking at conditions. the conditions of what makes those wali, that wali, for example, is valid, what makes those witnesses as basically acceptable, and what if we're talking about the wording of the offering consent, the wording. Instead of saying zawajtuka binti, he basically said a'taytuka binti. It's like, oh, are we going to consider that? What are we going to do? He used a different word, a different terminology. Then how do I understand? So that's that area. When you're talking about a valid marriage contract, you're basically talking about the implications of a valid marriage contract. You've got a valid marriage, therefore this is not zina. You've got the mahr, he has to pay the mahr. What if he didn't say a certain number in mahr? They just said, yeah, don't worry about it, the mahr, the number that you asked for. And then he said, yeah, well, I mean, thank you. That's basically a signature on a check, and he didn't even write a number. All right, I'll be happy to fill in the numbers that I want to be written on the check. He writes a certain number, and he says, whoa, how did you get there? No, I didn't consent to that. Or let's say, yeah, he didn't basically write a mahr. Is that going to make the marriage contract invalid? No, we've got a solution to that, where it's going to be called al-mahr al-mithal, where basically the equivalent mahr. We've got a solution to that, but is that going to make that marriage contract invalid, or is it going to be fasid? Or how do we understand as basically to fix the situation? Number 3, then that would mean if there is a valid marriage contract, well, the father is going to be responsible for shelter. The father is going to be responsible for children, the child support. He's going to be responsible for all the expenses that basically are to be covered for this marriage. Number 3, whether we're speaking about a home, a decent place of living, or whether we're speaking about food, or whether we're speaking about during life, in other words, covering the different expenses that are decent for this family, or whether we're speaking about after death, that yes, this woman inherits from this man, and even the children, they're basically attributed to the father. They are going to be attributed to the father because they belong to him, and they are basically considered that they are his responsibility. So, of course, here we go. And a wife would have the following duties. Remember, in Islam, al-ghunmu bil-ghurm. It's not enough that you would expect certain rights, but you also have certain responsibilities. All right. You have the right to have mahr, to get your expenses covered, to get a shelter, to basically be the inheritor, etc. All these different things. Well, that doesn't come at no price to basically pay. Yes, you get these rights, but you also have the responsibility, 1, to obey in good. 2, following and moving with the husband. He's going to be moving to, who knows, Chechnya. You're going to be moving to Chechnya. And children are to be considered from the husband. Let's say he claims that, oh, she cheated on me. No, we're going to say, wait a minute. Yeah, even if you were to do a paternity test, the children, they belong to you, because to us, what's more important than this paternity test is the child feeling that they are embraced. All of this dispute about paternity and all of that, as long as it's within this marriage, we care more about the child's mental health, this vulnerable child's mental health, than anyone else and being right. That's what we care about. So we want to make sure that you know and understand al-waladu lil-firash, that the son, this daughter, they're going to be attributed to you as their father, regardless of all those paternity tests and what they say. They're going to be attributed to you as the marriage, basically the marriage keeper, as the wali, as the qawam right there. They're going to be attributed to you. Okay, the family relations and what results to it is not considerable. So when we're talking about family relations and what results in dispute and all of that, that doesn't change, that this is a valid marriage contract. whether the father later on, after probably having the marriage basically become valid and everything's fine, and then the father just says, well, you know what? I didn't like him from the beginning. Sorry, too late, Dad. You didn't like him from the beginning. You agreed to this marriage. Okay. Now, an invalid marriage contract, in contrast to the valid marriage contract, one, no rights and no responsibilities. The man is not going to be obliged to pay in expenses, inheritance, or even the child be referred to the father. And this marriage or this relationship is basically called zina. If you mean an invalid marriage contract, simple and straightforward, this is zina. Now, Hanafi scholars, listen to this one. This is really important. I want you to really pay attention. If you need to grab a cup of coffee, grab it really quick, or just, I don't know, get a coffee drop or whatever it is, just wake up, okay? Now, Hanafi scholars, they do distinguish between an invalid marriage contract from day one, and between some contracts that may have, let's call it a deformity. Let's call it some kind of a problem with certain details. The offer and consent are there, but instead of saying zawajtuka, it basically says a'taytuka, or basically uses a different word. Okay, witnesses, one of them was deaf. So the madhab, or let's say the two were married, and then this lady comes up and she says, listen, your mom, she would always put you guys at my daycare, and whenever you guys were hungry, I was nursing you. So what are you trying to say, auntie? You're actually brother and sister in milk relations. What? We already have 5 kids. What are you saying? Yes, you are brothers and sisters. How many times did you do it? Oh, it was like almost 20, 30 times, 50 times. I can't even remember the number. So the Hanafi scholars, they'll say, listen, we can't necessarily say this is an invalid marriage contract. We will say this is fasid. So why did you call it? Why did you give it a new name? Well, we gave it a new name because of certain details that were not applicable, but the children, they're going to be attributed to their dad. We're not going to say that this was zina because the guy and the girl, they didn't know about all of this. They were only what, under the age of 2. They definitely didn't remember any of this. The mother died, and she probably was the only one to know this piece of information. Then they relocated to a new city. They didn't think at all that this needed to be something that one day that they will manage to find one another. So for al-madhab al-Hanafi, they say, listen, if we are to call it zina, then that straightforward is going to mean that they're going to be, let's say, punished as a zina situation. And we know that this wasn't a zina situation. And the mahar, well, are we going to tell the guy to tell the girl to return the mahar? They were in a marriage that they had even 5 kids and everything was going fine till this lady comes up and she says, I'm a witness that you're both brother and sister right there. And what about the child support? Is she going to say, well, is he going to come out and basically say, well, I have nothing to do with the children because they're not even attributed to me? What are we going to do? So that's where the very smart madhab Hanafi, they said, no, we have to differentiate between what would be considered an invalid, which would basically mean that all of this would become as the description of an invalid marriage contract, in between another sub-invalid marriage contract. What is that? They said, we're going to call it fasid, not batil. Because if you were to call it batil, then you come across a new dilemma. So due to some confusions in the details, then they would debate about certain details. What if one of the witnesses was deaf? What if, what about the number of let's say this milk mother came in and they disputed, well, even though the madhab Hanafi says even if it's 1 drop, that's enough. Unlike the other scholars, and specifically al-Malikiyya and al-Shafi'iyya, they'll disagree with the number and they'll say it's 5 and up. Okay, but so how do we understand this? That's when even within the madhab Hanafi, then they went into some details and debated the details. Should we categorize this as valid or invalid or batil? Well, batil is invalid, or fasid. Fasid is like, it's an incomplete. Let's call it incomplete conditions. Incomplete and not necessarily invalid to mean a complete failure. Okay, it's incomplete. I'll just leave it at that. Okay, so things like parenthood, waiting period, dowry or mahr, and no punishment for zina basically applies for fasid. So when we talk about fasid marriages, exactly like we would probably speak about no wali for a marriage, the wali, they brought the brother instead of the father who was present, and they were not supposed to be going to the brother unless the father was not there. Okay, and let's say we're missing number of witnesses. We're talking about marrying the 5th woman, and even though the 4th wife says, "Well, I didn't even finish my waiting period yet. How did you get married for the 5th time?" And then let's give this comparison between batil and fasid. So in a batil/invalid marriage contract, all the scholars agree that an invalid marriage contract simply means zina. There's no question about it. Now, what does that mean? Well, the implication is that there's going to be a punishment for zina. If they had a marriage experience before, it's going to be stoning till death. Yes, we're going to dig a hole, put them in this hole, and we're going to be throwing pebbles at them till they die, or till whoever had a marriage experience basically dies. Yes, as harsh as you may say it. Well, that's for zina, that's the punishment of zina for a person that had a marriage experience before. If a person did not have a marriage experience before, it would be 100 lashes. 100 lashes. Differences of opinions on the taghrib, on basically expelling them for a year. Anyhow, the third thing is that no one can validate even the highest judge in court, even consider it as a Supreme Court. They cannot change the fact that this is an invalid marriage contract. That's it, one straight thing. There's no waiting period, but wait up on that one, because there is no waiting period, but when we speak about financial rights and responsibilities, we agree on that one. That's pretty straightforward. But for the no waiting period, the Prophet ﷺ said, listen to this, مَلْعُونٌ مَنْ سَقَى مَاءَهُ زَرْعَ غَيْرِهِ. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever irrigates someone else's plantation, crops, is mal'oon. This isn't talking about somebody going in their neighbor's field and basically deciding to get the hose of water and basically just, somehow start irrigating their neighbor's yard. This isn't talking about that. This is talking about intimacy. This is talking about when a woman is pregnant, this other man knows that this woman is pregnant or does not know this woman is pregnant, and then basically is intimate. That's what metaphorically is basically meant with that. So in that situation, to say no waiting period, it doesn't mean we're talking about, no waiting period so she can go on and basically just get married in no waiting period. We would say, well, should she wait at least 1 menstrual cycle? 2, 3 menstrual cycles? Is it enough to do a pregnancy test? Well, we know that a pregnancy test is not necessarily accurate till a number of different days, possibly 40 days pass by. That doesn't even appear on a pregnancy test till some while passes by. So when we look at no waiting period, just want you to understand that piece of it. It does not prove parenthood. Even if we were to get paternity test, we would not necessarily say this proves parenthood. But just on a side, modern scholars reinvestigated that one, and they said if we end up not proving parenthood and end up basically having these children, let's say, harvest and pay the price of a sin that their father had committed, then we are basically making two sins, not one. Okay, what are you saying? So if this man commits zina and he gets a child, and this child basically grows up to be a kafir, then what are we then doing? We just, one, we committed the sin, and two, we ended up having a child grow as a kafir. That's even a worse sin. So the modern scholars, they debated this one, and they considered that no, if you're capable of proving paternity through paternity tests, and you're capable of fighting in court in order to bring this child into Islam and basically correct the sin that you had committed and bring this child into Islam, then this is far way better than letting this child and say, well, there's no paternity to be proven, and therefore I'm just going to let go as if I don't exist and as if he doesn't exist. No, you cannot get away with that sin just like that. You have to pay the price and basically hold accountability. Now, that doesn't prove the right of inheritance. So in other words, you can come up and say, well, hey, we're in a relationship. Well, just because they're in a relationship, that doesn't prove inheritance, the right to inherit. Let's say in a facet, and remember, there's no such thing as a facet marriage contract. To the majority of the scholars, they only have two classifications. It's either going to be batil or it's going to be sahih. That's it. That's all they have. It's either going to be batil, invalid, or valid. Only the Hanafis said, no, we actually have a three classification. We have fasid, we have sahih, we have batil. Okay, so Hanafis, how do you define and what is the implication of a fasid marriage? Well, they said, well, we have different opinions amongst us. So yeah, the Hanafis, we have different opinions on what would fall within this category. That's number one. And number two, we may even disagree on whether this should be categorized within batil or fasid or even sahih. So we'll really, amongst each other, we'll really sometimes debate on different pieces of it, but we'll just let you know that we basically consider that number one, this is not punishable by zina, because the Prophet ﷺ had basically said, the Prophet ﷺ basically said that we're supposed to be seeking area of doubt. In other words, give an area of doubt and basically the benefit of the doubt to make sure that we don't necessarily punish somebody that may not necessarily fit completely under the category of batil. Okay. So you don't consider it as punishable by zina because you consider that there's a place of doubt. Yes. And separation only takes place through divorce or judge separation. So, okay. So you are saying that no one has the power to basically end it? Yes. Except a judge can do what is called fasq. That's different. A judge's power can come in and let's say the husband says, I don't want a divorce. The judge will say, guess what? I'm a higher power than you, mister. And yes, as a judge and as basically the government, I'm going to come in and say, even if you choose not to divorce, I'm going to give an order to basically bring about an end to this marriage. But I don't want to get a divorce. Yes, I understand. But guess what? Now, as a judge, I make the final court order, and therefore this is going to be applicable. And if you go around and if you will go against my order as a judge, you will be punished. Okay, let's see, and before an actual, and then of course, divorce is different. Okay. Divorce basically is whether it's the two agree or whether it's the man basically gives that decision to divorce. That's basically what a divorce is. Khul'a is different. The initiative is starting from the woman to say, you know what, I don't want this marriage. And we'll talk about the rulings of divorce and what that looks like. Said, oh, you know, we're going to discuss later, inshallah, the options of divorce and what that looks like and so forth. Okay, and before an actual marital relation taking place, no rights are considered. So what do you mean by that? So we're going to differentiate between a facet marriage contract before they're intimate and after they're intimate. So what do you mean by that? So before they're intimate, we're going to say, you know what, this is batil. That's it. Separation order. That's it. There's no way that this can go on. But what if we had 5 kids involved? Then we're going to say, okay, well, this needs to be reviewed. And you need to go to your nearest judge and basically let him decide what madhab and how to bring the solution and what madhab we're going to take in consideration and basically study the situation. Okay. So then in that situation, if there are these kids involved, then we're going to look into the circumstance. If there are these kids involved, then we've got a different situation. In case of a marital relation, some rights are considered, such as parenthood. We need to make sure that the kids don't pay the price of a wrong choice that one of the parents may make. Okay, so just to keep that one in mind.
Subhanallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam, Noura. What's up? How are you doing?
Oh, alhamdulillah. I was just saying, a lot of times, the one parent will try to bribe the kid or take it out on the kids.
Absolutely. So that's that whole thing that we want to make sure that the children don't pay the price. And then we need to make sure that we have things in place and considering the vulnerable's rights basically as our priority. So now we go into that mut'a marriage. How do we understand mut'a marriage? What is the ruling of it? And so forth. So that's when we would basically just want to understand when the madhab Hanafi said this is fasid, this is not at all to say that this is acceptable. Okay, this is not at all to get, paintbrush it and make it or think of it as acceptable. Okay, so let's see, for the madhab Hanafi, like I said, they might have disagreed on certain details. And of course, certainly when we look at these conditions and for the madhab Hanafi, they said, listen, this is a bad condition and definitely a condition that we shouldn't be accepting. But if let's just assume, okay, I had the wali and I had these 2 witnesses. And I basically had seen, all the different details and all of that. And then there was this addition that was added that this would be a marriage just for 4 years. So the madhab Hanafi will say, the 4 years part, we're going to take and delete that piece of within the marriage contract, but we're going to say that this is a valid marriage contract. And therefore, we're going to be saving a family here. That was al-madhab al-Hanafi. They said, we're going to be saving a family. And instead of basically calling it batil, we're going to put in the category of fasid because there is an actual marriage. That's what they're going to say. For the rest of the scholars, they said, no, let's call things for what they really are. By putting a temporary a date on it or by putting some kind of an expiration date. Just from the start, this is a premise, this is a foundation that you basically are saying that you are ending this. So in other words, you had come in with a completely wrong intention. This cannot be as classified as a valid marriage contract, and let's call it for what it is. It's a form of zina. Since the Prophet ﷺ had said that this is invalid till judgment day, then therefore the Prophet ﷺ is telling us that this is invalid, period. Let's call it for what it is. And those are the majority of the scholars. I want you to see that. It'd be really interesting. And what about what was said that some scholars permitted mut'a marriage? So number one is that you want to remember fiqh is not dependent on who said what, even if it's a sahabi, but what evidence that supports it. But the evidence that supports it is basically going to be the area that determines whether something's acceptable or not. Not all companions had all the knowledge of the latest report. Abdullah ibn Abbas may not have had the information since anyways he was a preteen. You can't compare it to Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was in his late 20s, when he said that the Prophet ﷺ forbid mut'a marriage and eating donkey's meat during the time of Khaybar. Ali ibn Abi Talib was in his late 20s when this was said, when the Prophet ﷺ died. But Abdullah ibn Abbas was a preteen. The last thing he would probably care about was marriage and all the different details in marriage. Not, of course, this is not to underestimate the ilm of Abdullah ibn Abbas whatsoever. He's a great Sahabi. The Prophet ﷺ had made the dua, Allahumma faqihhu fi din wa allimhu ta'wil. But regardless of who said what, we would know that we would have basically different reports because the Sahaba, they were not necessarily all present when anything that the Prophet ﷺ might have said or done, not everyone might have been present. So therefore, once we've got evidence to support, improve a timing for a certain thing, then this would give me as what is nasikh and what is mansukh, what is abrogated and what abrogated what. Okay, and in Sahih Muslim, and remember, this hadith is in al-Bukhari, in Sahih Muslim, based on the hadith, narrated that the Prophet ﷺ said, I had allowed you before to have mut'a with women. In other words, temporary marriage. God Almighty had forbid this till judgment day. Whoever has any woman, then he must let her go and do not take anything from what you had given them. In other words, in terms of mahr, don't take anything. In other words, what is that? That's basically making a final end to bringing basically a final determination that mut'a marriage is invalid, batil. Now, here's one thing. There's a different type of marriage contract. When you look at mut'a marriage, okay, so we understand right now the category of batil and fasid. So al-madhhab al-Hanafi doesn't necessarily call it that it's permissible, but just called it that it is an area of shubha and an area of doubt and an area basically area of doubt, not meaning doubt that we're not sure whether it's haram or halal. No, that's not what we mean by that. But we mean by that, is this applicable to basically be fit for zina category or not? Why? Because Islam is not a stick on people's backs. Islam considers that what we seek is doubt to prevent people from getting punished for a crime. That's what we're trying to do. Okay, let's see. What about different types of marriage contracts? Different types of marriage contracts basically married a woman on a condition to divorce her. Married a woman on a condition that he would divorce her on a certain day. So, we're not saying that this is necessarily mut'a marriage, but he would say, you know what? It's okay, we're not going to give a certain expiration date, but I'm going to say you know, after I graduate, we didn't put in the marriage contract, but I'm just letting you know that once I graduate, my intentions is that I'm going to go back home. I'm going to get married to a woman that basically comes from my country, which my parents are going to choose, etc. And I'm just letting you know that at one point that I'm going to be divorcing you. I've got this intention to divorce you after I graduate. For example, appointing any date invalidates the marriage contract. This is equal to basically muta marriage. So whether the person had a hidden intention or whether he was vocal about it, at the end, it is basically invalid. For the Hanafi, they said, you know, we can't actually agree with you on that one. Why not? They said, well, the contract is valid, but his intention in that condition to divorce, just like we said in muta marriage, we're actually just going to consider that that intention that is not a valid intention, and we're going to call that an evil intention, and we're going to just say, listen, that intention that you had, you need to give up on it because that is not acceptable, even if the woman accepted, even if her wali accepted, because you're supposed to come in with the intention that this marriage would be permanent and you would invest in making it a successful relationship, not come in with an evil intention that one day, you know, I'm just going to give up on you. And I'm just going to find somebody that I really think deserves all my investment in. Humaira, you had a question here. Go ahead.
Sheikh, I wanted to ask about fasted. So if we discover that the marriage is fasted, we can continue, right? If I'm not mistaken.
So according to the madhab Hanafi, you just need to understand that this condition is basically invalid. But here's the thing. It depends on the case that made it into fasid. So certain fasid marriages, they have to be ended on the spot. So for example, this woman that popped up and said, hey, you guys were in my daycare. I nursed both of you, your brother and sister. From the day that they knew that, that's it. This is a fasid marriage and on the spot. We don't have to raise it to court. We don't need a mufti and all of that. We just know that, hey, she had said she's a woman of piety. She's not making this up. She's a woman that indeed we were told that there was this lady that was basically our nanny and for both of us. And we know that, but we thought that this never happened. We didn't know what she did behind closed doors. We didn't know any of this. So in that situation, we wouldn't say, oh, we can just go on with a fasid marriage and therefore we don't have to worry about what this lady said. No, this actually,
even if they have children,
regardless if you have children or not. Regardless, there are certain fasid marriages, regardless if you have 20 children. At the end, there are certain fasid marriages that on the spot, they are to be ended and the children will be attributed to their dad, but not necessarily say, yeah, every fasid marriage you can, if there are children, we could just go about and, you know, disregard that condition and all of that. And since there are children, we could just dismiss all the conditions. Nope, not necessarily, not too fast, depending on the case and depending on the situation.
And Sheikha, previously in the slide you mentioned that the judge will end the marriage even though if the husband wants or not. Why will the judge do that? Because it's a fasid marriage?
Do what?
I mean, end the marriage, even though the husband doesn't want to.
Why would the judge end the marriage?
Yeah.
Depending on the circumstance, he may need to fasakh. It's called fasakh. The judge may do fasakh. Perhaps maybe the man, let's say, or the woman, they belong to a certain kafir cult. And say, oh, they belong to a certain kafir cult. She was, she says she's Muslim, but all the evidence showed that she belonged to some kind of a stonecutters or some kind of a Freemasonry or some kind of a Gothic group or whatever. And hey, that nullifies your faith on the spot. So the Qadi will say, oh, yeah, the marriage contract was valid, but right now, this needs to be fasakh. We need to do a separation. This is right there, bringing in a judge's order. But he says, but I don't want to divorce her. I love her. Yeah, that's very nice. I'm sure it's going to be very heartbreaking for you to leave a woman that you really love. But this woman is belonging to a cult that is a kafir cult, or, that is a kafir cult, and therefore this would nullify her aqidah. For example, of course, it doesn't have to be exclusive to that. Okay, so, and let's say something further. Let's say she says, hey, he's abusing me. I'm going through this domestic violence. And basically he says, but I don't want to divorce her. The Qadi will say, yes, of course, Mr. Narcissist. You don't want to divorce her because you want to keep a victim under your power. Well, guess what? We right now need to make sure that the government is basically in support and in defense for those that are vulnerable. So the Qadi will come in and basically say, she came in complaining about this. There was enough evidence to prove that she was going through 1, 2, 3 domestic abuse from you, or 1, 2, 3 harm from you, etc. Then even if you choose not to divorce, the Qadi will say, I'm going to do fasakh. Sorry. Marriage was supposed to be bringing in peace, tranquility, and basically good relations, not necessarily an area for you to practice your evil behavior and all your illnesses. The Qadi will come in and say, that's right there, but I don't want to divorce her. Too bad. We're the higher court ending. Bang your head against the wall. We're not going to let this go. That's how it goes. Noura, go ahead, dear.
And
Go ahead.
sorry, Sheikh, I'm so sorry. Just to make it clear, and the battle, you have to finish it at the spot when you just recognize it's a battle marriage contract,
Al-Batil
right?
marriage is on the spot. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
If all
All right.
scholars agree that this is batil, there's no question about it. This is zina. Plain zina if you were to continue.
Jazakallah khairan.
Wa iyyakum. Noura, go ahead, dear.
Oh yeah, so I just had a question on actually two questions. So the first one is sometimes the breastfeeding mothers, they breastfeed let's say like someone from the family or something, and then they forget they did that, right? So in that situation, should they just try to avoid that?
So
Because
certainly, Noura, it's best to always avoid that, because documentation may sometimes, it may not always be there. You just never know what happens. We
Yeah.
don't encourage that, but people have different circumstances. People have different preferences. I have my preference that I prefer that, children basically take formula, perhaps not myself. I mean, some women might say, I'd rather have my child take formula than actually end up, who knows, I might die, or probably that documentation gets lost and all of that. Then marry, for example, his sister in milk relations. For example, someone else might say, well, no, I'm sorry, I disagree with you. Islam would not put it as an option as milk relations, but as to let us know that this is in children's favor, and basically milk or this type of organic and nursing milk, it has good health facts to the child. Don't want to give them formula. Do you know what formula does to the brains? And she can give you all these evidences that basically may support her perspective. So I just have to just let you know that people have different preferences, and I just have to be mindful of those preferences as long as they're not haram.
okay,
That's it. Yeah,
okay.
I just have
And
to
the
be
second,
mindful.
sorry, the second question I had was, I know that, and especially like in the Arab culture, they'll marry like closer cousins and stuff like that. If I mean, is the hadith that the Prophet about what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said? I mean, I don't know. Is it authentic about not marrying like really close relations?
So, it's not authentic, but we do have a number of different resources, a number of different hadith that did encourage not marrying from the relatives. Okay. And we know right now, backed up by scientific evidence. And of course, we know that, genetic disorders and all of that. We know right now by all these different studies that marrying from your close relatives, that you are more likely to get genetic disorders than actually from people that are distant. So we know that piece of it. But at the same time, like I said, it is halal, but that does not mean that Islam is telling you that, yeah, I want you to go farther. Yes, we do have, even if they're not authentic necessarily to be on the highest level of authenticity, but they do support one another to basically let us know that it is encouraged to not marry from closer relatives because it does enhance the possibility in the possibility of having genetic disorders basically going down the chain and basically down through that line of family relations. So we know that scientifically, we know
Just
that
realize something, subhanallah. Yeah, because what you're talking about with the DNA sequence and passing along and all that stuff. Because Adam alayhi salam, when him and Hawa had kids and they married, yani from them, yani. There wasn't all this long genetic sequences and changing of DNA and all that. You just made me realize that. Okay, sorry, I'll be quiet now.
That's okay. I wasn't during the time of Adam, and I don't know if I would have been a matchmaker because definitely the options were not too big. All right. So at the end is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at that time did permit it. So what was the hikmah at that time and all of that, if they were not going to get married and except probably marry from the Netradels, then that would have been probably a different option. I don't know what the situation was like. We just do know that that this was permitted at the time, and that in different like what we know that Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam even married two sisters in one marriage. And was it Yaqub? Yeah. Two sisters in one marriage. So in other words, co-wives. But in Shari'at al-Islam, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, that's actually not permissible. So at the end is that just recognize that there were different shari'ahs, but at least in the final sharia of Islam that, we have our own laws of what would be considered incest and what is not considered incest and what is considered as valid marriage and what's not a valid marriage and so forth. So we would basically go based on Islam. Not that Islam encourages close relative marriage and it's and all of that. No, Islam, in fact, we do have evidence to discourage from that, but at the same time, just letting you know about that. Okay, let's move on with nikah al-muhallal. What does that mean? The man that marries a woman to make her lawful to her previous husband. What? Why are we making her lawful to her previous husband? And what's going on? So if a man divorces his wife 3 times, but he's not allowed to go back to her unless she marries another man. Who are you punishing here, the man or the woman? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically setting a discipline for all. By the way, just a side note, just when you get into a disagreement in how you may understand a dispute between a husband and a wife, when you hear both sides, it comes out as a completely different way to research this dispute. when you hear both sides. And number two is that you want to remember, just because you have your opinion on who's at fault does not necessarily mean you know all the details. Marriage problems and the dispute within marriage, there's so much more that is what is not said than what is being said. The dispute could not necessarily be on yes, I said this and I said that, but it could be on even something further, that it's an issue of certain sentiments that they did not manage to disclose. So they, just keep in mind that your opinion about the dispute and who's being punished right there, at the end of the day, just keep in mind that it's not necessarily a punishment to one or two. It might have actually been just one thing to discipline both sides, regardless. So in a complete marriage, basically, we've got a complete marriage. This isn't a facet marriage. This is a complete valid marriage. Okay. And we basically have a contract right there. And we're not talking about just a marriage contract, but we're talking about these two are married. These two basically were intimate. They might have kids, etc. Now, then they get a divorce. Okay. And this man makes 3 divorces. And he says, well, I want to go back to my wife. So then he basically says, well, the Qadi told me that I can't get married to my wife unless she gets married to another man. So he goes and agrees with, I don't know, some guy, Saad, and he says, Saad, the Qadi said I can't go back to my wife unless she marries another man. So how about you come in and basically, get married to her? But listen, I don't want you being intimate with her, okay? I just want it to be just a marriage contract and just for a day. And then we're going to say, hey, this guy was married to her and it wasn't something serious, but we're just going to say that you got married to her and that way I can bring her back. This is nikah al-muhallal. The Prophet ﷺ had called this person a tays al-mustar, the rented mule. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in regards to the 3 divorces that will happen, he said, فَإِن طَلَّقَهَا فَلَا تَحِلُّ لَهُ مِن بَعْدُ حَتَّى تَنْكِحَ زَوْجًا غَيْرَهُ. Pretty straightforward ayah. If he divorces her, that is 3 times, then he would not be permitted to go back to her unless she basically gets married to another man. But here's one thing. That is without prior agreement. In other words, she is supposed to get married to this man without prior agreement in any divorce condition or anything like that. But no, she's getting married. It's like, okay, my marriage didn't work out. I'm going to move on with my life, finished my iddah. I'm going to move on with my life. And she basically gets married to another man. And again, I guess she's got an attitude. Even the second man she gets a divorce from, and then she started comparing both. And then, hey, her first husband comes in and he says, you know what, let's get this working out. How about we get back together, get this working out and all of that. And then she then says, you know what, yeah, maybe we could do that. And the first love is always the best love, she said. And they both agreed to get basically. Now, here's one thing. If he divorces her, then she's not permitted to basically be with her husband unless she marries another man. Now, as for the ruling on al-muhallal, so this kind of marriage is invalid, void, and is impermissible with no question about it. Of course, the money that this guy got in order to get married to his wife, basically, or his ex, in order to get this working out, would basically be haram money. Remember, we said most of these marriages is all about money. Ibn Mas'ud had basically said the Prophet ﷺ had cursed the man that marries to permit the marriage, meaning the person that wanted to permit somebody else's marriage. In other words, after the divorces that he had done, basically this man gets involved, and the man that she was married to is also cursed. The Prophet ﷺ basically لعن المحلل والمحلل له. All right. Now, the Prophet ﷺ named that man that accepts to get married, basically the second husband, to permit this. He called him a rented mule or a rented bull. Okay, now we know that one. Well, so what about the Hanafis? Did they regard that this is valid or not valid, or did they call it fasid? Okay, that's the debate. So the majority of the scholars, they'll call it batil on the spot. Let's just say if we are talking about, yes, the man basically gets married and then later he repents and he says, you know what, astaghfirullah. And he married this woman. It was supposed to be for a month just to get basically this woman later getting married to her second husband, but he saw she was a good akhlaq, she was really a good woman, and then he made his repentance. She was always reminding him of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. She didn't even know that there was an agreement. She didn't even know that there was an agreement between her ex and this guy. But then this guy realizes that she's a woman of taqwa. And he decides that, you know what, I'm going to repent and I'm going to make my istighfar and I'd like to go on with this marriage. Now, for the madhab Hanafi, they will regard that the condition was fasid between the ex and the guy. And they'll say that was an invalid condition anyways. He has to make a big tawbah for sure and repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the marriage, since there was the marriage contract, there was the wali, there was the consent, there was the witnesses, there was a wedding, all of these different things happened, then this is a valid marriage contract, but the condition was fasid. This is what the condition was fasid. And therefore the condition is what is invalid, and therefore he just needs to repent and move on. Okay? Now, nikah al-shighar. What is nikah al-shighar? So it's the marriage, and of course a man would marry a woman, and instead of giving her the mahr, he basically trains his own sister. So what does that mean? So he basically says, hey, I've got a sister. Let's say Tawfiq says, hey, I've got a sister. And Mu'tasim has a sister. So Tawfiq and Mu'tasim are best friends. He says, listen, how about we get married? I can't afford to give mahr, and neither can you. You know, we're best friends, but we can't afford to give mahr. How about, instead of asking me to pay mahr, and certainly I know I'm not giving it to you, but at least you're the wali. So Mu'tasim and Tawfiq, they say, how about this? I mean, what we could do is that I'll let you marry my sister, and you let me marry your sister. And that way, hey, it's a sister to a sister. We don't have to give mahr, because at the end of the day, we're just, we know each other's situations, and how about that? This is nikah al-shighar. Okay, the Prophet ﷺ, why was this even done? And why was this even talked about? Because during Jahiliyyah, it was a practice that they used to do. Okay, during Jahiliyyah, it was a practice that they used to do, and because they regarded women as property. Okay, they regarded women as property, and then they would do these kind of business contracts. Hey, I'll give you my sister, you give me my sister, and bro, we're, the differences. We don't have anything to differ about because it's a woman for a woman. There we go. Because they regarded them as property. Islam comes in and says, absolutely not. The Prophet ﷺ basically said, there is no shighar in Islam. What is shighar? Shighar is basically this act that we talked about. So what is the ruling on shighar marriage? So the majority of the scholars, remember, they regarded that, wait a minute, from the beginning, since there's no shighar in Islam, they basically said, well, this is impermissible and basically a batil, an invalid marriage contract. The other scholars, specifically the Hanafi, they basically said, well, the marriage is not invalid per se. The marriage itself is valid. You got all the conditions there. But because we don't have mahr being stated, and the condition would basically, would be abused from the wali, and the girls might not have known all the details, but it was abused from the wali. They basically the girls gave consent. There was no problem with the consent. It was just a problem with the mahr that they were in secret about. So in that situation, the women, they don't, even if they don't have mahr, they would have mahr called mahr al-mithl. What is mahr al-mithl? Mahr al-mithl, if there was no mahr stated, then there would be the equivalent mahr. Mahr al-mithl simply means equivalent mahr. What does that mean? So let's say this girl is Bengali, okay? And she comes from, I don't know, an aristocratic community. So we'll say, okay, hold on, the mahr in your society, or at least in your community, meaning the women that are your cousins, since you're considered an upper class in Bangladesh, your sisters, your aunts, well, how much was their mahr? Oh, their mahr was this much. Okay, we're going to consider that is the equivalent mahr for you. Let's say the other guy was actually considered from the poorer area, okay, from the poorer area, and then we'll say mahr al-mithl. Your sisters, your aunts, maybe your aunts were long time ago, but maybe your sisters, your cousins, what was their mahr? Their mahr was this much. So that's going to be your mahr. That's mahr al-mithl. Okay, so just because the mahr was not mentioned does not mean that this girl is going to pay the price and say, well, that's it. No mahr was mentioned. I'm doomed. I'm basically not going to be given my rights. And of course, just to mention that one, for the Hanafis, they regarded the condition is invalid, but the marriage can be fixed. The marriage is fixed. We'll give them, and we'll solve it by putting an equivalent mahr. Okay, let's see another condition or another type of a marriage contract. A woman conditioning on a man to divorce a woman in order to accept getting married. Okay, Saad meets this woman, Latifa, and Latifa says, I don't want to be a second wife, but in order for me to accept getting married to you, you're going to have to divorce your wife. So he says, you know what? Okay, I'll divorce my wife. So he basically divorces his wife, even though it's haram, because the Prophet ﷺ had already mentioned it is not permissible. Look at this hadith in al-Bukhari. It is not permissible on any woman to ask for the divorce of her sister, meaning her Muslim sister, to leave her space. To leave her space basically within the marriage. She only gets what she was destined to have. So what is that supposed to mean? Well, that's basically to say that women, for those that were conditioning, and I had I remember at least this time, it was a Palestinian girl that got married to this Egyptian sheikh. He was an imam at a masjid in New Jersey or Maryland, one of those. And then he basically tells her, I'm going to divorce my first wife. And he didn't divorce his first wife as he had promised. And she then said, well, he promised to divorce his first wife and he didn't. Does she have the right to say, well, he did it, he was supposed to? That's not fair. So here's the thing. Your condition was already haram, to say that I would accept to get married only if you were to divorce your first wife or your second wife or whatever it is. That's an invalid condition in itself. The second thing is that this man is really a person that lacks integrity, a man that would accept to divorce his wife for another woman is not showing love to you, but is reflecting a lack of integrity, a lack of principle, a lack of commitment on his behalf, that a new circumstance will let him give up on the previous.
Wouldn't that be on both? Lack of integrity on both?
It's not, absolutely, it's lack of integrity on both. It's a greedy woman that basically wants to end somebody's happiness in order for her to be happy, and lack of integrity on his behalf to basically divorce a woman that he's supposed to be committed to and divorce her to find another mate. It's a lacking integrity on both. There's no question about that. All right. But here's the question. Let's just say this girl comes up and she says, well, he basically agreed to divorce his wife, and now I'm not ready, and I was not at all accepting to be a second wife. That's not what I basically wanted. And now I'm in a polygamous relationship, which I was not whatsoever fine with. Then in that situation, we would say, well, you knew that he had a first wife. This condition that you put on him is anyways an invalid, greedy, and a mean condition. That condition he was not supposed to accept, and you were not supposed to set. The condition itself is not acceptable, and therefore the condition does not make the marriage invalid, but it makes the relationship lacking integrity. Makes the relationship lacking integrity, but the marriage itself is valid. Okay, let's say زواج المسيار. Now we're getting into another type of a business. What is it? Someone says, I'm a woman that is very rich, and I can basically, I've got all the money, I've got the cars, I've got everything. I just need a good guy basically to come in and basically, in a halal relationship. I don't need necessarily a guy to get married and basically pay for all my expenses. I'm already rich enough, and I'm already making a lot of money. Don't need any of that. I just need a halal relationship. And plus, I don't want the guy to come in and start telling me when to go and when to come and giving me all these orders and to leave my job. No. I want to live like a queen. I want to be the one to make orders. I've got my money. I just want a halal relationship because I don't want to fall in zina. Let's say a woman says that. Is this halal or not? The guy is like, yeah, well, you know what? Thank you. I don't have to pay for anything. Yeah, you don't have to pay for anything. Well, wow, this is such a privilege. Yeah, sure. A halal relationship where I don't have to pay the price for it. Yeah, what a good thing. Sure. Yeah, I'll accept that. Now, scholars actually had differences of opinions about this marriage. This did not happen before. This is only something that happened recently. We're talking about in our modern times, when we had some business women, especially in the Gulf. They have the money, and man, I'm sorry, the people of the Gulf are living in such taraf that emptied them of any family, any life, any commitment, any deen, and any akhlaq. I'm sorry, the Gulf countries had been emptied of integrity, had been emptied of life, had been emptied of happiness, had been emptied of family. They had been emptied of everything. Money, wallahi, takes away and wipes away all meanings. If money is the most valuable thing to you, then you are going to be somebody that can give up on your principles, on your deen, on your family, just for the sake of money. These are cheap people. These are cheap people. A person of value is a person that is not willing to give up on their family, on their principles, no matter what the cost was. But if money becomes the most valuable thing to you, then you are really a coward, a cheap person, a person that lacks values. Anyhow, nevertheless, let's say, is this, the woman says, thank you for giving me all that introduction. I still want to know one thing. Is this halal or not? I have a different perspective than you. Thank you for telling me all of that, but I just want to know if it's halal or not. I disagree with the narrative that you laid out. I just want to know it's halal or not. I'll say, number one, the modern scholars had differences of opinions on how they've debated this type of marriage. The first group of scholars, they said, this is invalid. Why? They said, because when you look at conditions in a marriage contract, the conditions are supposed to be going in parallel and based on the meaning of what marriage is all about. Marriage is all about investing in a social relationship, in a marriage where she's obeying the husband. We've got qawama, we've got family, this is what marriage is. So the first scholars, they said this is invalid because you just emptied marriage from what it really is, what really defines it. The second group of scholars, let me go back to the first group of scholars that considered it as valid. The first group of scholars that considered it valid, they said, well, I mean, you've got a marriage contract, you've got the wali, you've got the ijab and qabul, you've got the consent, you've got the witnesses, you've got the wedding, you've got all of that. All of that is that she chose to give up on her rights. She's okay with that. And therefore, the first group of scholars, they said it was valid. The second group of scholars, the first group of scholars, they said it was invalid. Okay, now I'm contradicting the evidences because I got lost. Okay, let me start over. Okay, the first group of scholars, they considered it as invalid. They said even if you were to have the different basis of a marriage contract, they said, well, they just emptied marriage and what it stands for. Then therefore, this is invalid. The first group of scholars basically said it was invalid. The second group of scholars, they said it is valid. Why? They said, well, because remember when you said that if you had the offer and consent and you had the wali was there, the witnesses are there, and the details about them being, I guess, reached the age of puberty and all of these different things, and Muslim and non-Muslim or Muslim and Muslim and all of that, you had everything there. And in the wedding, you want to add that too. And we also had a beautiful wedding. Anyway, she could afford all of that. So in that situation, they said, well, look, we've got the basis of a valid marriage contract. Her deciding to give up on her rights, well, that's optional. If she chose to give up on it, then why not? So the second group of scholars, they said it's a valid marriage contract. And then the first ones, their objection was, well, wait a minute, if you're going to say that this is going to be a valid marriage contract, do you recognize the problems that it may bring along? Problems? What are you talking about? What problems? Well, I mean, I want you to look into the case. If there were children involved, and let's say the woman loses all her money, goes bankrupt, what are we going to do then? Are we going to leave this woman basically with no support and financial support and no responsibility right there? Or are we going to go back to the basis of what defines a marriage? What are you going to do? And how are we going to understand this condition that she basically had said, I'll give up on my marriage right, I'll give up on my financial rights, and that way you can have this. Now, the other scholars, Hanafi, they said, well, we wouldn't necessarily consider it as invalid or a valid one, but in general, we will at least call it fasid. Why did you call it fasid and not batil? They said, well, I mean, the condition itself can require scrutiny. We may put regulations on it And rather than just say it's not valid because it suits some people's circumstances. If they're agreeing, adults consenting, and they're agreeing, and we may put conditions on how to regulate this relationship. That the Hanafis, they basically said, well, we can make a relationship. Well, the ones that said it was invalid, they said, look at you. Do you see what you are doing right now? You are turning a marriage relationship into a transaction. Do you see the problem, they said? Do you see where and what this is going to lead to? This is going to lead to not a mutual family investment. This is going to be a money investment. You just changed it from a marriage relationship, marriage contract to a business contract. Once you do that, they said, then you empty the investment, you empty the determination, you empty it from what it stands for. You see where you're going? That's the debate that they basically debated. And you could see that each one had a good point, and it's really, it's really hard to come to a final one. But let's see. Muslims throughout history, of course, they didn't know this kind of marriage. This type of marriage is known, like I said, in Gulf areas, which, because of course, resulted in a lot of women not getting married, at least from the rich women, because if they're looking for rich guys, well, the rich guys are a smaller number, and they end up being these rich women. They're looking for a person that basically is not going to be looking for a business and all of that. All right. So that's that area that basically, I would say, brought in these types of problems. You had a lot of women that are not married, and very beautiful women, very competent, very qualified, very good women. And I met many in Kuwait and Qatar. I was really surprised that these beautiful women, these women of deen, these women that appear to be very good, competent, qualified women, why they weren't getting married. And they're very rich. I mean, super dirty rich. Okay. But subhanAllah, and of course, not many very rich men like them would necessarily want to marry a rich woman, because to him, a rich woman comes with certain conditions. If she's going to be rich, then she's going to be basically wanting me to basically spend on her the same richness that she wants to live in. And of course, to him, he just wants multiple women. He'd rather marry a poor woman, 4 poor women, and he'll be the one to basically determine the amount of money spent on each and every single one, than marry a rich woman. So you see that price? Allah al-Musta'an. Valid since its conditions are met, but hated since it makes a business contract. Allahu A'lam. Of course, according to some scholars, and the scholars that considered it not valid, they said the main mean of marriage and responsibility is missing. Preponderant, the marriage is valid, but Allahu A'lam, not recommended social-wise, as it may cause a lot of problems. I'm going to stop right here. And if there are any questions, we're going to continue with something called Zawaj Friend, okay, and Zawaj Urfi. And next week, inshallah, we'll be discussing that, and we'll also be discussing, can I put a condition in the marriage contract that I would continue my education, or that he would have to accept that I guess, not go out of my country, or that I would be basically, doing such position or whatever it is, or I put another condition that he would never get married to a second or a third or a fourth wife, and I would be the only one. Is that a valid condition? We're going to talk about that not next week, actually, the day after tomorrow. So stay tuned. Ustazah Umayya, go ahead, dear. You want to say something?
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله
Walaikum
وبركاته.
salam.
For زواج المسيار, we could say that there is different wisdom behind to make it like to be a يعني haram, isn't it?
Well, like I said, if modern scholars, they debated that, and I pretty much, made it like a debate and kind of like a communication, kind of like a, laid it out like a demonstration right there, demonstrated it in like an act that this one said and that one said, just to make it easy. But of course, it'd be really interesting to see your point of views on what opinion do you think makes more sense. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily, when there are differences of opinions on a matter, I like to stay not necessarily determined on a particular opinion, because I do recognize that people have different circumstances, and I like to give the space for people to investigate their circumstances rather than me imposing my view, and my view can be, this combination of perhaps maybe the area that I come from, the family, maybe my own perspective as a woman, and of course, my own perspective perhaps as not a wali, and so many different things can impact my view or your view or the other person's view. Well, that's the same thing, is that I would say I personally prefer, if there isn't a definitive haram like mut'a marriage, I'm not going to say, yeah, well, let me think about it, or I won't have a definitive answer, because there needs to be a definitive answer for this one, because I've got all the evidences and all the authentic hadith that are definitive in making a final answer to this. But when it comes to marriage, misyar, I would say there isn't a definitive one. I will say, each one had their own view. I don't have necessarily a hadith, like the definitive hadith in regards to mut'a marriage. So I'll say, it's a place of debate.
So no evidence.
I don't want to say no evidence, because we just laid out a lot of different evidences for each side.
Yeah.
When
Can
you
we say it's
of marriage, the definition of marriage, isn't that an evidence? Well, it's an evidence, but then we can still debate, but there isn't necessarily, a thabit in this whole thing where I've got a definitive hadith or a definitive ayah, but I've got different ways of how we can read this.
Can we say that no daymuma in zawaj, in this kind of zawaj, as an evidence or illah?
No, we cannot, because there is a daymuma. Daymuma, in other words, this isn't temporary. They didn't agree on a date, on an expiration date.
Mm-hmm.
They agreed that this would be forever.
Mm-hmm.
To somehow say, well, there is a possibility of maybe this isn't going to work out. Well, this is the case for each and every single marriage. Every single marriage, there's a possibility that it might not work out. Does that mean every single marriage is invalid until proven otherwise? No.
Or zawaj al-shighar.
Zawaj al-shighar is different, because
Can I
that's
ask you a
just
question?
an
No, there
issue
is
of muhar
special
not
question.
being. Go
There's
ahead.
a question about shighar. We know that that the hadith that Prophet ﷺ said, al-Muslimuna على شروطهم in the sulh, about the
Right, we're gonna discuss.
But can we use it as the zawaj al-shighar, that I'll not make you marry my sister till you make me marry your sister, if there is يعني رضا or شرط الرضا.
Okay, here's the thing. We're going to talk about conditions next week, because not because two people consented to a condition is necessarily enough to say that this condition is valid. any condition that is not acceptable in Islam is going to be invalid even if two adults consent. All right? So just because two adults consented, that doesn't make the condition above the law. Okay? The law, meaning Sharia, meaning Islam, has the upper, let's say the upper constitution or the upper hand to say if that condition is going to pass or not. No one is above the law. The law, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is Allahu Akbar. So we're going to talk about conditions and which conditions are valid, which conditions are not valid. And we're going to talk about those ahadith. Every shart laysa fi kitabillahi fahuwa batil. Every condition that's not in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is impermissible or is void. And we're going to discuss the different conditions and or the conditions that may be consented or may not be consented. How do we understand all of that? So we're going to get into that, inshallah.
Jazakallah khairan.
Wa iyyakum. Humaira, you want to say something, dear?
Sheikh, I wanted to also ask about marriage as shigar, and I wanted to know if a mahr is there, will it still be batil or it's another case?
If the mahr is there,
Yeah.
okay. If let's say Mu'tasim and Tawfiq, each one, they basically, so Mu'tasim, when he married Tawfiq's sister, he gave her mahr and everything was fine. And Tawfiq, well, when he married Mu'tasim's sister, gave her mahr, that's not shigar. Okay,
all right.
just because they may exchange sisters and it happens to be a marriage that worked out, that is not shigar. Shigar is when they would basically agree to cancel out mahr in trade of a sister to a sister. That's shigar. Okay, but if both they got married, by the way, my uncle married well, hold on. Okay. My mom and my dad, along with my uncle and his sister, they are basically treated like that. So my father married my uncle's sister. Okay, am I doing this right? Yeah, my father married my uncle's sister, and my uncle married my dad's sister. Okay, yeah.
We have the same case in my family, my aunt.
Okay, so now they're protected. Whew, that was close, right?
I wanted to ask, Jazakallah khairan.
I know you were like, that's it. If they gave the mahr, everything's fine. Yeah, that's it. That's okay. All right. All right, so this is it. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Let me end